The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert airbase as Captain Sarah Mitchell performed her pre-flight inspection of the A-10 Thunderbolt II. The aircraft, affectionately known as the Warthog, sat heavy and imposing on the tarmac, its twin engines mounted high above the fuselage and its distinctive nose-mounted GU-8 cannon pointing toward the horizon. Mitchell had flown this particular aircraft dozens of times, but today felt different. There was tension in the air that went beyond the usual pre-mission jitters. The briefing room had been buzzing with nervous energy just an hour earlier. Intelligence reports indicated that a convoy of friendly forces had become separated from their main unit during a nighttime movement through hostile territory. The convoy consisted of 3 Humvees carrying 12 soldiers, including a forward observer team crucial for coordinating air support in the region. They had last reported their position nearly 6 hours ago, and since then, radio contact had been intermittent at best. What made the situation particularly concerning was the complete failure of the GPS satellite network in their operational sector. A massive solar storm had been wreaking havoc on electronic systems for the past 48 hours, and the military satellite constellation was among the casualties. Navigation systems that had become second nature to modern warfare were suddenly unreliable or completely offline. Ground units were reverting to map and compass navigation, while aircrew found themselves dusting off skills they hadn't used since training. Colonel James Harrison, the wing commander, had made it clear during the briefing that this was no ordinary search and rescue mission. The area where the convoy was believed to be located was known to be crawling with insurgent activity. Recent intelligence suggested that enemy forces had been actively hunting for isolated friendly units, hoping to capture prisoners or inflict casualties that would make headlines back home. Time was running out, and conventional search patterns would take too long to cover the vast expanse of desert terrain. Mitchell climbed into the cockpit of her A-10, running through the familiar startup procedures while her mind processed the mission parameters. She had been flying combat missions for 3 years, but most of those had involved close air support for troops in contact or pre-planned strikes against known targets. This was different. This required the kind of tactical thinking and situational awareness that separated good pilots from great ones. The radio crackled to life as she completed her engine start sequence. Hammer 2-1, this is Desert Control. You are cleared for taxi to runway 27 for immediate departure. Mitchell acknowledged the transmission and began rolling toward the active runway, her wingman, Lieutenant David Chun in Hammer 2-2, following close behind. Chun was relatively new to the squadron but had already proven himself to be a skilled pilot with sharp eyes and good instincts. As they lined up on the runway, Mitchell could see the heat shimmer already beginning to rise from the concrete despite the early hour. The desert was unforgiving during the day, with temperatures that could climb well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. For a downed aircrew or lost ground unit, the heat could be as deadly as enemy action. Every minute that passed reduced the chances of a successful recovery. Hammer flight, you are cleared for takeoff, winds light and variable, contact departure on button 4, came the tower controller's voice. Mitchell advanced the throttles and felt the familiar surge of power as the twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up to full military power. The A-10 might not be the fastest aircraft in the inventory, but it was built for exactly this type of mission: low altitude, close support, and the ability to operate from austere airfields when necessary. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, and Mitchell immediately began a climbing turn toward the search area. Below her, the airbase quickly fell away, replaced by the endless expanse of desert that characterized this part of the world. From altitude, the terrain looked deceptively simple, just sand and rock formations stretching to the horizon. But Mitchell knew that down at ground level, it was a maze of wadis, ridges, and hidden valleys where a small unit could disappear completely. Desert Control, Hammer 2-1 is airborne with 2-2, proceeding to search Grid Alpha 7 as briefed. Mitchell transmitted as she leveled off at their initial search altitude of 8,000 feet. The response came back immediately, tinged with the urgency that had characterized all communications since the convoy went missing. Roger, Hammer 2-1. Be advised we have lost satellite communications with all units in your operating area. You are now the primary eyes and ears for this operation. Additionally, be aware that ground-based navigation aids are also experiencing interference. You may need to rely on visual navigation techniques. The implications of that transmission hit Mitchell immediately. Not only were they searching for a lost convoy in hostile territory, but they were doing it without the technological advantages that modern military operations typically relied upon. GPS was out, satellite communications were sporadic, and even ground-based navigation beacons were unreliable. It was like being thrown back into the 1970s, when pilots navigated by dead reckoning, pilotage, and sheer skill. Mitchell glanced at her navigation display, which was indeed showing erratic readings. The GPS coordinates were jumping around randomly, making it impossible to get an accurate position fix. She switched to her backup navigation system, only to find it suffering from similar problems. The only instruments she could trust completely were her compass, altimeter, and airspeed indicator, the basic flight instruments that had been reliable since the dawn of aviation. 2-2. Are you seeing the same navigation problems? She asked her wingman over the tactical frequency. Affirmative, 2-1. My GPS is completely unreliable, and my INS is drifting badly. I'm going to have to navigate visually from here on out. Chen responded, his voice betraying just a hint of concern. This was exactly the kind of scenario that old-school instructors had warned about during training. Modern pilots had become so dependent on technology that many had never developed the visual navigation skills that were once considered essential. Mitchell was fortunate that her first instructor had been a Vietnam veteran who insisted that his students learn to find their way around using nothing but their eyes and basic instruments. At the time, it had seemed like an outdated skill. Now, it might be the difference between mission success and failure. As they approached the search area, Mitchell began studying the terrain below with new intensity. Without GPS to tell her exactly where she was, she needed to identify landmarks and use them to build a mental map of the area. The desert might look featureless from a distance, but up close it was full of distinctive features, rock formations, dried riverbeds, roads, and even individual buildings that could serve as navigation references. She pulled out her paper chart, something she hadn't used in actual flight operations for months, and began correlating what she saw on the ground with the topographical features marked on the map. There was a distinctive horseshoe-shaped ridge system about 5 miles to her north, and a major highway running roughly east-west that she could use as a baseline for her search pattern. Desert Control, Hammer 2-1, is beginning visual search of Grid Alpha 7. Be advised that we are navigating visually due to GPS failure, but we have good visibility and are maintaining proper search altitude, Mitchell reported. The response from the ground controller carried a note of relief. Roger 2-1, understood on your navigation situation. Be advised that we have intel suggesting the lost convoy may be somewhere in the vicinity of checkpoint Charlie 5, but that position data is also suspect due to the same GPS issues you're experiencing. Checkpoint Charlie 5 was supposed to be a road junction about 20 miles northeast of their current position, but without GPS, locating it would require careful navigation and good weather. Fortunately, the weather was cooperating. The desert sky was crystal clear, with visibility extending to the horizon in all directions. If the convoy was out there, they would have a good chance of spotting it from the air. Mitchell began flying a systematic search pattern, using visual checkpoints to ensure complete coverage of the area. She flew parallel tracks separated by 1 mile, maintaining a constant altitude and airspeed to ensure consistent visual coverage. Chen followed about 2 miles behind and slightly offset, providing a second set of eyes and backup coverage in case Mitchell missed something. The searching was methodical but exhausting work. Every shadow, every dirt road, every cluster of rocks had to be examined carefully. The convoy could be hidden under camouflage netting, tucked into a wadi, or simply blending in with the natural terrain colors. Desert camouflage was incredibly effective in this environment, and a stationary vehicle could be nearly invisible from the air unless you knew exactly where to look. After 45 minutes of systematic searching, they had covered roughly half of their assigned grid square without finding any trace of the missing convoy. Mitchell was beginning to feel the familiar pressure that came with time-sensitive missions. Every minute that passed was another minute that friendly forces remained in danger, potentially under enemy observation or even attack. 2-1, This is 2-2. I'm picking up some dust clouds on the horizon, bearing approximately 0.45 degrees from my position. Could be vehicle movement. Chin's voice cut through Mitchell's concentration. Mitchell immediately adjusted her heading to investigate Chin's sighting. Dust clouds in the desert could mean many things: wind-blown sand, civilian traffic, military vehicles, or even enemy movement. But, in their current situation, any sign of vehicle activity was worth investigating. She descended slightly to get a better view while maintaining enough altitude to avoid small arms fire from the ground. As they approached the area where Chun had spotted the dust clouds, Mitchell could see what had caught his attention. There were indeed vehicles moving along what appeared to be a dirt trail, but at this distance it was impossible to determine if they were friendly or enemy forces. The vehicles were moving in a tactical formation, with spacing that suggested military training, but that didn't necessarily mean they were the missing convoy. 2-2. I'm going to drop down for a closer look. Stay high and keep watch for any other activity in the area, Mitchell instructed as she began a shallow descent toward the moving vehicles. As she got closer, details began to emerge. She could see 3 vehicles in a convoy formation, which matched the number from their missing friendly unit. They were following a dirt road that wound through a series of low hills, moving at a steady but cautious pace. The vehicles appeared to be Humvees, but positive identification would require getting close enough to see markings or other distinguishing features. Mitchell was about to descend further when something caught her eye that made her blood run cold. Following roughly parallel to the convoy's route, but separated by about half a mile and concealed by a ridgeline, was another group of vehicles. These were moving faster and appeared to be trying to get ahead of the convoy, possibly to set up an ambush or blocking position. The tactical situation suddenly became much more complex. If the first group was indeed their missing convoy, they were about to drive into a trap. If the second group was their convoy, and the first group was enemy forces, then friendly forces were already in contact and needed immediate support. Either way, Mitchell and Chun had stumbled onto a developing tactical situation that required immediate action. 2-2. Do you see the second group of vehicles moving parallel to our initial contact? Mitchell asked her wingman, wanting to confirm what she was observing. Affirmative, 2-1. Looks like we've got 2 separate groups maneuvering down there. This could be a pursuit or an ambush setup, Chin replied, his voice tight with concentration. Mitchell's mind raced through the tactical options available to her. Without reliable communications with higher headquarters, and without GPS to provide precise coordinates, she was essentially operating independently. The rules of engagement were clear about engaging hostile forces, but positive identification was crucial, especially in an area where both friendly and enemy forces were known to operate. She decided to get closer to the first group of vehicles, hoping to spot some identifying feature that would confirm their identity. American military vehicles typically had distinctive marking patterns, antenna configurations, and equipment loads that could be identified from the air by a trained observer. As she descended to about 2,000 feet above ground level, details became much clearer. The lead vehicle in the first convoy had the distinctive sloped armor and antenna configuration of a military Humvee, and she could see personnel wearing what appeared to be American military uniforms and helmets. More importantly, she spotted the characteristic whip antenna of a military radio system and what looked like the thermal sight housing of a tow missile system mounted on one of the vehicles. 2-2. I'm seeing positive indicators that our first group is friendly forces. Standard military equipment and uniform patterns. But that second group is still unidentified and appears to be maneuvering to intercept, Mitchell reported. As if to confirm her assessment, she saw one of the soldiers in the lead Humvee point up at her aircraft and wave, the universal signal for friendly recognition. But even as relief flooded through her at finding the missing convoy, the tactical situation was becoming more urgent by the minute. The second group of vehicles was definitely moving to cut off the convoy's route, and they would reach the intercept point in just a few minutes. Mitchell pulled back up to a safer altitude and began planning her next move. She had found the missing convoy, but now she had to figure out how to help them avoid what was shaping up to be a deadly ambush, all while operating without the navigation and communication systems that modern military operations depended upon. The next few minutes would test every skill she had learned as a combat pilot. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness as Mitchell watched the tactical situation develop below her. The friendly convoy was moving steadily along the dirt road, completely unaware that hostile forces were maneuvering to cut them off. Without working radio communications, she had no way to warn them of the impending danger. The solar storm that had knocked out GPS was also causing severe interference with most radio frequencies, making it nearly impossible to establish contact with ground units. Mitchell keyed her radio anyway, trying multiple frequencies in hopes of reaching someone. Any station, this is Hammer 2-1 with urgent traffic for Convoy Oscar 7. You have hostiles moving to intercept your position. Break east immediately. I repeat, break east immediately to avoid contact. Static was the only response. She tried the emergency guard frequency, then the convoy's assigned tactical frequency, but the electromagnetic interference was simply too strong. The radio waves were being scattered and absorbed by the charged particles streaming from the sun, the same phenomenon that had disabled satellite navigation systems worldwide. 2-1, I'm not getting any response on the radio either. But we need to do something fast. That hostile element is almost in position to cut off the convoy's route. Chin's voice crackled over their interflight frequency, which was apparently still working at short range. Mitchell's training kicked in as she analyzed the tactical geometry developing below. The convoy was moving through a valley with steep ridges on both sides, following what appeared to be the only practical route through the terrain. The hostile forces had positioned themselves to block the exit from the valley, effectively creating a kill zone where the convoy would be trapped with limited options for escape or evasion. But there was another route. Mitchell could see a secondary trail that branched off from the main road about a mile ahead of the convoy's current position. It appeared to lead around the northern edge of the ridgeline, potentially allowing the convoy to bypass the ambush site entirely. The problem was getting that information to the convoy commander without radio communications. 2-2, I'm going to try something. Stay up here and keep watch on that hostile element. If they make any aggressive moves, we may need to engage immediately. Mitchell transmitted as she began descending rapidly toward the convoy. What Mitchell was planning was both dangerous and unconventional, but it was also the kind of creative problem-solving that characterized the best combat pilots. If she couldn't talk to the convoy, she would have to communicate through actions. The A-10 was a loud, distinctive aircraft that would definitely get the attention of anyone on the ground. She intended to use that to her advantage. Mitchell approached the convoy from behind at low altitude, using the terrain to mask her approach until the last possible moment. Then, just as she crested a ridge line, she popped up directly over the lead vehicle, her twin engines roaring at full power. The soldiers in the Humvees looked up in surprise as the Warthog thundered overhead, barely 500 feet above their heads. But Mitchell wasn't done. She immediately pulled into a sharp climbing turn and came around for another pass, this time approaching from the east. As she flew over the convoy again, she waggled her wings repeatedly, the universal aerial signal for "follow me" that had been used by pilots since World War I. Then, she flew directly toward the alternate route she had spotted, hoping the convoy commander would understand her intent. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, the convoy commander, had been leading military vehicles through hostile territory for over 8 years, but he had never seen anything quite like this. The A-10 pilot was clearly trying to communicate something urgent, and the wing-wagging display was unmistakably a "follow me" signal. But follow where and why? Williams grabbed his binoculars and scanned the area ahead of his convoy, looking for whatever threat the pilot might have spotted. It didn't take long to find it. Through the heat, shimmer, and dust, he could see the distinctive outline of what appeared to be technical vehicles, pickup trucks modified for military use, moving rapidly to block the road ahead. The A-10 pilot had spotted an ambush that Williams's ground-level perspective had missed entirely. "Driver, stop the convoy." Williams ordered his driver, Specialist Jennifer Martinez, who immediately brought the lead Humvee to a halt. The other vehicles in the convoy stopped as well, their crews scanning for threats while waiting for orders. Williams watched as the A-10 flew toward what appeared to be a secondary trail leading off to the north. The pilot was clearly indicating that route as an alternative, but Williams needed to make a quick decision. Following an unmarked trail in hostile territory was risky, but driving into a known ambush was almost certainly suicidal. Martinez, take the next trail to the right. We're changing route, Williams decided, trusting the aerial reconnaissance that only the A-10 pilot could provide. From her vantage point high above, Mitchell watched with relief as the convoy slowed, and then turned onto the alternate route she had indicated. But her relief was short-lived. The hostile forces had apparently noticed the convoy's change in direction and were adapting their own tactics accordingly. Some of the vehicles from the second group were breaking off and moving to intercept the new route. 2-2, the hostiles are repositioning. Looks like they're trying to cut off the northern route as well, Mitchell reported to her wingman. I see it 2-1. Should we engage? Chen asked, his finger hovering over the weapon select switch. Mitchell hesitated for a moment. The rules of engagement required positive identification of hostile intent, which they certainly had based on the obvious ambush setup. But engaging without coordination with higher headquarters and without precise target coordinates was a significant decision. Once they started shooting, there would be no taking it back. The decision was made for her when she saw muzzle flashes from the hostile vehicles. They had opened fire on the convoy, which was now clearly visible from their elevated position on the ridge line. Tracer rounds were arcing through the air, and Mitchell could see the convoy vehicles taking evasive action, speeding up, and maneuvering to avoid the incoming fire. 2-2. Hostiles are engaging friendly convoy. We are cleared hot for immediate close air support. I'll take the northern group. You take the southern blocking force, Mitchell transmitted as she rolled into an attack run. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was designed specifically for this type of mission. Its GAU 830mm cannon could deliver devastating firepower with pinpoint accuracy, and its armor could absorb significant battle damage while keeping the aircraft flying. Mitchell lined up her first target, a technical vehicle that appeared to be directing the attack, and squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared to life with its distinctive BRRRT sound, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds toward the target. The effect was immediate and devastating. The technical vehicle simply disintegrated under the impact of multiple 30mm rounds, sending debris flying in all directions. The other hostile vehicles immediately began taking evasive action, but the open desert provided little cover from an attack aircraft. Chen was equally effective with his attack on the southern group. His first burst disabled 2 vehicles and scattered the remaining enemy forces, who began abandoning their positions and fleeing on foot. Within minutes, the ambush had been broken and the immediate threat to the convoy eliminated. But the tactical situation was far from resolved. Mitchell could see additional dust clouds on the horizon, suggesting that reinforcements might be moving toward their position. The convoy was still separated from friendly forces, still operating without reliable navigation or communications, and still in the middle of hostile territory. Finding them had been just the first step in what was becoming a complex rescue operation. 2-1, this is 2-2. I'm showing low fuel after that engagement. I've got maybe 20 minutes before I need to head back to base, Chen reported over the radio. Mitchell checked her own fuel gauges and grimaced. The low-altitude maneuvering and combat had consumed fuel rapidly, and she was in similar condition. But leaving the convoy without air cover was not an option, especially with possible enemy reinforcements approaching. Roger, 2-2. You head back for fuel. I'll stay with the convoy as long as possible, Mitchell decided. She would rather risk fuel starvation than abandon the ground forces while they were still in danger. As Chen departed for the return flight to base, Mitchell continued to orbit over the convoy, which had resumed movement along the northern route. The trail was rougher than the main road, requiring the vehicles to move more slowly, but it appeared to be leading them away from the immediate threat area. Without GPS, Mitchell was navigating by dead reckoning and pilotage, using prominent terrain features to maintain her position relative to the convoy while monitoring for additional threats. The desert landscape was challenging for this type of navigation, but her earlier training was serving her well. She used the horseshoe-shaped ridge system as a primary reference point, along with the major highway that ran east-west through the region. As she flew, Mitchell began to piece together a larger picture of what was happening on the ground. The solar storm hadn't just affected military systems, it was causing problems for everyone. She could see civilian aircraft struggling with navigation issues at the civilian airport to the east, and even commercial truck traffic on the highways appeared confused and disorganized. But the electromagnetic interference was also affecting the enemy. Their coordination seemed less precise than it might normally be, suggesting that they too were struggling with communication and navigation problems. This could work to the convoy's advantage, but only if they could reach friendly territory before more organized opposition arrived. Mitchell established a communication routine with the convoy using aerial signals. When she wanted them to stop, she would circle tightly overhead. When she wanted them to proceed, she would fly ahead of them and waggle her wings. It was primitive compared to modern digital communications, but it was effective and didn't rely on any electronic systems. After following the northern trail for about 30 minutes, the convoy reached a junction with another road that appeared to lead back toward friendly territory. Mitchell consulted her paper chart, using visual landmarks to confirm their approximate position. According to her calculations, this road should eventually connect with a major supply route that was regularly patrolled by friendly forces. But as they approached the junction, Mitchell spotted another problem. There were fresh tire tracks in the sand, suggesting that vehicles had recently used this intersection. Given the tactical situation, those tracks could indicate either friendly patrols or enemy movement. Without being able to communicate with headquarters, there was no way to determine which was more likely. Mitchell decided to scout ahead while the convoy held position at the junction. She flew along the road for several miles, looking for any signs of recent activity. The landscape was empty as far as she could see, but that didn't necessarily mean it was safe. Desert warfare often involved patience and concealment, with forces remaining hidden until the optimal moment to strike. As she turned back toward the convoy, Mitchell noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. There were vehicles approaching from the south, 3 or 4 of them moving fast along a different road that would intersect with the convoy's route in just a few minutes. At this distance, she couldn't determine if they were friendly or hostile, but given recent events, she had to assume the worst. Mitchell immediately flew back to the convoy and began circling tightly overhead, the signal for them to stop and take defensive positions. The convoy commander apparently understood the message, because all 3 vehicles quickly moved off the road and positioned themselves in a triangular defensive formation with good fields of fire in all directions. As the approaching vehicles got closer, Mitchell descended for a better look, prepared to engage if they showed hostile intent. Through her binoculars, she could make out details of the lead vehicle. It appeared to be a Humvee with military markings, but enemy forces had been known to use captured equipment, so that wasn't conclusive. Then, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. The lead vehicle had a large orange panel displayed on its roof, the standard marking for friendly forces conducting search and rescue operations. These weren't enemy reinforcements. They were part of the rescue force that had been searching for the missing convoy. Mitchell immediately broke off her attack run and began signaling the convoy to resume movement. The relief she felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the realization of how close they had all come to a friendly fire incident. Without proper communications and identification procedures, even rescue operations became dangerous in the electromagnetic chaos caused by the solar storm. As the 2 groups of vehicles converged, Mitchell could see soldiers dismounting and greeting each other with obvious relief. The missing convoy had been found, the immediate threats had been neutralized, and rescue forces had arrived to provide escort back to friendly territory. But the mission wasn't over yet. They still had to make the journey back through potentially hostile territory, and Mitchell's fuel situation was becoming critical. She checked her fuel gauges one more time and made a quick calculation. She had enough fuel for perhaps 15 more minutes of flight time, which would allow her to escort the combined convoy for only a few more miles before she would have to break off for the return journey to base. The thought of leaving the ground forces while they were still in hostile territory was difficult, but running out of fuel and crashing in enemy territory would help no one. Mitchell made one final orbit over the reunited convoy, waggling her wings in a farewell salute before pointing her aircraft toward home. As she climbed to a more fuel-efficient altitude, she reflected on how much aviation had changed since the early days of flight, when pilots navigated by landmarks and communicated through hand signals. Today's experience had been a reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, could never completely replace basic flying skills and tactical judgment. The return flight to base would be another exercise in visual navigation and fuel management, made more challenging by her depleted fuel state and the continuing electromagnetic interference. But Mitchell felt confident that she could make it back safely. After all, she had just successfully completed one of the most challenging missions of her career, using nothing more than her eyes, her experience, and the fundamental skills that had been the foundation of military aviation for nearly a century. The fuel gauge needle seemed to drop visibly as Mitchell began her solo journey back to base. At 8,000 feet above the desert floor, she was high enough to glide for considerable distance if her engines failed, but low enough to maintain visual contact with the ground for navigation. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as she realized she was now completely on her own, flying through potentially hostile airspace with no electronic navigation aids and barely enough fuel to reach home. The electromagnetic storm that had caused so much chaos was beginning to show signs of subsiding, but the effects would linger for hours or even days. Mitchell could see some improvement in her radio reception, with occasional bursts of clear communication breaking through the static. But GPS remained completely unreliable, and she couldn't count on any electronic navigation system to guide her home. She pulled out her paper sectional chart and spread it across her lap, something that felt almost archaic in the modern cockpit of the A-10. The chart was marked with pencil annotations from her pre-flight planning, showing the route to the search area and key landmarks along the way. Now she would need to reverse that route while dealing with reduced fuel and the possibility of additional enemy activity. The landscape below told its own story as she flew southwest toward base. She could see the aftermath of the engagement from earlier, black smoke still rising from the destroyed enemy vehicles, and tire tracks in the sand showing where the convoy had changed course to avoid the ambush. It served as a stark reminder of how quickly situations could develop in combat, and how critical it was to maintain situational awareness at all times. Using her compass and stopwatch, Mitchell calculated that she should reach the distinctive horseshoe-shaped ridge system in approximately 12 minutes, if she maintained current heading and airspeed. That would serve as a key navigation checkpoint for the remainder of her flight. From there, she could follow a bearing of 240 degrees magnetic for roughly 40 miles to reach the vicinity of her home airbase. As she flew, Mitchell found herself reflecting on the mission from a tactical perspective. The loss of GPS and satellite communications had turned what should have been a routine search and rescue operation into something resembling aerial warfare from decades past. But, in some ways, that had worked to their advantage. The enemy forces had been equally affected by the electromagnetic interference, which had disrupted their coordination and possibly prevented them from setting up a more effective ambush. The radio crackled to life with intermittent transmissions as atmospheric conditions fluctuated. She caught fragments of conversations between other aircraft and ground stations, all reporting similar navigation problems and communication difficulties. It seemed the entire theater of operations was adapting to the electronic warfare conditions created by the solar storm. Any station, this is Desert Control with a general broadcast. All aircraft in the AOR are advised that GPS navigation is unreliable due to atmospheric disturbance. Pilots are directed to rely on visual navigation procedures and report position using landmarks when possible. Weather conditions remain favorable for visual flight rules throughout the region. The transmission was weak and distorted, but it confirmed what Mitchell already knew. She wasn't the only pilot dealing with these challenges, and flight operations throughout the region were being affected. But it also meant that air traffic control would have limited ability to provide navigation assistance or traffic separation services. Each pilot was essentially operating independently, responsible for their own navigation and collision avoidance. As she approached the Horseshoe Ridge system that served as her primary navigation checkpoint, Mitchell began to notice something unusual on the horizon. There appeared to be additional dust clouds rising from several different locations, suggesting widespread vehicle movement in the area. Some of these could be friendly forces responding to the convoy situation, but Others might represent additional enemy activity prompted by the morning's engagement. Mitchell decided to investigate the closest dust cloud, which appeared to be moving roughly parallel to her course toward the airbase. As she approached, she could see that it was indeed a military convoy, but determining whether it was friendly or hostile would require a closer look. The electromagnetic interference made it impossible to contact them by radio to request identification. Dropping down to a lower altitude, Mitchell could see that the convoy consisted of 5 vehicles moving in tactical formation along a dirt road. The vehicles appeared to be a mix of Humvees and larger transport trucks, suggesting a logistics or supply operation rather than a combat patrol. But appearance could be deceiving, especially when enemy forces were known to use captured equipment. As she overflew the convoy, Mitchell noticed that none of the vehicles displayed the orange recognition panels that friendly forces were supposed to use during air operations. This could mean they were enemy forces, or simply that they were friendly forces who hadn't received the latest recognition procedures. Without radio communication, there was no way to resolve the ambiguity definitively. The tactical dilemma was complicated by her fuel situation. She couldn't afford to spend time conducting detailed reconnaissance of every vehicle movement in the area, but she also couldn't ignore potential threats to friendly forces or to her own base. The convoy was moving in the general direction of the airbase, which could be significant if they had hostile intent. Mitchell decided to compromise by continuing toward base while maintaining visual contact with the convoy when possible. If they made any obviously hostile moves or appeared to be targeting the airbase, she would have to take action despite her fuel constraints. For now, she would note their position and report it once she regained reliable communications. The fuel gauge was becoming a constant source of concern as she continued flying toward base. According to her calculations, she should have enough fuel to reach the airfield with a small reserve, but that didn't account for any additional maneuvering or delays. In military aviation, fuel planning was always conservative, but when operating in hostile territory, even conservative planning sometimes wasn't enough. As she crested a ridgeline about 15 miles from base, Mitchell caught sight of something that made her heart sink. There was heavy black smoke rising from the direction of the airfield, suggesting that something significant had happened while she was away on the mission. The smoke appeared to be coming from the flight line area, where aircraft were normally parked and fueled. Mitchell immediately tried to establish radio contact with the airbase tower, cycling through all available frequencies in hopes of finding one that wasn't blocked by interference. After several attempts, she managed to raise a weak response from the control tower. Tower, this is Hammer 2-1 inbound from the northeast with emergency fuel state. I'm seeing smoke from the base. What's your status? The response was fragmented and difficult to understand, but Mitchell was able to piece together that the base had been attacked by indirect fire, mortars or rockets, while she was away. The attack had caused damage to several aircraft and support facilities, but the runway remained operational for emergency landings. Hammer 2-1 Tower. Runway 27 is clear for emergency approach. Be advised that crash and rescue services are currently engaged with fires on the south ramp. Wind is calm. Visibility 10 miles. Altimeter 3002. Mitchell acknowledged the transmission and began setting up for an immediate approach to the airfield. Her fuel situation was now critical, with barely enough remaining for one landing attempt. There would be no opportunity for a missed approach or go around if something went wrong on the first try. As she approached the airfield pattern, Mitchell could see the extent of the damage caused by the morning's attack. Several buildings were burning, and there were emergency vehicles scattered around the flight line area. But the runway appeared undamaged, and she could see that other aircraft were successfully landing despite the chaos on the ground. The approach was routine despite the emergency circumstances. The A-10 was designed for operations from austere airfields, and landing on a slightly damaged runway was well within the aircraft's capabilities. Mitchell touched down smoothly and immediately began taxiing clear of the active runway, guided by a ground controller who was directing traffic around damaged areas of the airfield. As she shut down the engines and completed her post-flight checklist, Mitchell reflected on the complexity of the morning's mission. What had started as a simple search and rescue operation had evolved into a combat mission, a navigation exercise, and and emergency recovery all rolled into one. The loss of GPS and satellite communications had forced everyone, pilots, ground forces, and controllers, to rely on fundamental skills and procedures that were often overlooked in the age of high technology. Ground crew personnel met her aircraft as she climbed out of the cockpit, eager to hear about the convoy rescue mission. Word had already spread around the base that Hammer Flight had successfully located the missing soldiers and provided critical air support during an enemy engagement. But, for Mitchell, the mission wasn't complete until she had been properly debriefed and all lessons learned were documented for future operations. The base intelligence officer was waiting in the squadron building, ready to conduct an immediate debrief while the details were still fresh in Mitchell's memory. The information she had gathered during the flight, enemy positions, vehicle movements, and the effectiveness of visual navigation techniques would be valuable for planning future operations in the degraded electronic environment. Captain Mitchell, we need to start with the exact location where you found the convoy and the enemy forces you engaged, the intelligence officer began, spreading a large-scale map across the briefing table. Mitchell studied the map carefully, using the landmarks she had memorized during the flight to reconstruct the locations as accurately as possible. Without GPS coordinates, everything had to be referenced to prominent terrain features or known reference points. It was time-consuming and less precise than electronic navigation, but it was the best they could do under the circumstances. The convoy was moving along this trail system, approximately here, Mitchell indicated with a pencil mark on the map. The enemy forces were positioned to the south and east, using this ridgeline for concealment. They had at least 6 vehicles that I could identify, but there may have been additional forces outside my area of observation. As they worked through the debrief, Mitchell realized that her mission had been part of a much larger pattern of enemy activity throughout the region. The attack on the base had been timed to coincide with the convoy ambush, suggesting a coordinated operation designed to take advantage of the communication and navigation problems caused by the solar storm. The intelligence officer explained that similar attacks had been reported at several other installations throughout the theater, all occurring within a narrow time window when satellite systems were most severely affected. The enemy had apparently been planning this operation for some time, waiting for the right conditions to execute multiple simultaneous attacks. Your successful interdiction of the convoy ambush probably prevented a significant propaganda victory for enemy forces, the intelligence officer concluded. Captured American personnel would have been extremely valuable to them, especially during a period when our technical advantages were neutralized. Mitchell nodded, understanding the broader implications of the morning's events. But her mind was already turning to the tactical lessons that needed to be incorporated into future training and operations. The reliance on electronic systems had made military forces vulnerable to natural phenomena like solar storms, as well as to electronic warfare attacks by sophisticated enemies. The debrief continued for another hour as they analyzed every aspect of the mission in detail. Mitchell's use of visual navigation techniques, her improvised communication methods with the ground forces, and her tactical decision-making during the engagement all became part of the official record that would inform future training and doctrine development. As they wrapped up the formal debrief, Mitchell learned that Chun had successfully refueled and was already preparing for another mission to provide cover for additional rescue operations in the affected area. The situation was far from over, and there would likely be more flights required before all friendly forces were accounted for, and the immediate threat was neutralized. But there was something else that needed immediate attention. The convoy that Mitchell had observed on her return flight was still unaccounted for, and its intentions remained unknown. Additional reconnaissance flights would be needed to track their movements and determine whether they posed a threat to base operations or other friendly forces in the area. Mitchell volunteered to fly the reconnaissance mission once her aircraft had been refueled and inspected for battle damage. The maintenance crew had already begun their post-flight inspection, checking for any signs of damage from the morning's combat engagement or the emergency landing conditions at the damaged airbase. As she walked around her aircraft with the crew chief, Mitchell noticed several small holes in the fuselage that hadn't been there before takeoff. The enemy forces had apparently scored some hits during the engagement, but the A-10's legendary durability had brought her home safely despite the damage. It was a reminder of how quickly combat situations could escalate and how important it was to maintain tactical awareness at all times. The maintenance crew estimated that repairs would take about 2 hours, giving Mitchell time to grab a quick meal and plan for the next mission. But first, she wanted to check on the status of the convoy she had successfully guided to safety. Radio communications were slowly improving as the electromagnetic storm subsided, and she hoped to get confirmation that all personnel were accounted for and safely back in friendly territory. The news was encouraging. The convoy had successfully linked up with the rescue force and was already back at a secure forward operating base. All 12 soldiers were accounted for and in good condition, despite their extended period of isolation in hostile territory. The forward observer team would be back in action within hours, ready to resume their critical mission of coordinating air support for ground operations. As Mitchell headed to the flight line for her next mission, she couldn't help but reflect on how the morning's events had tested every aspect of her training and experience. From basic stick-in, rudder flying to complex tactical decision-making, the mission had required skills that spanned the entire spectrum of military aviation. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that even in an age of advanced technology, there was no substitute for fundamental flying skills, good judgment, and the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances. 2 hours later, Mitchell was back in the cockpit of her freshly repaired A-10, preparing for what she hoped would be the final mission of a very long day. The maintenance crew had patched the bullet holes and replaced damaged components with remarkable efficiency, but the scars of combat were still visible in the form of fresh rivets and slightly mismatched paint where repairs had been made. The electromagnetic interference from the solar storm was finally beginning to subside, allowing intermittent GPS signals to penetrate through the atmospheric disturbance. But the signals were still unreliable enough that visual navigation remained the primary method for precise positioning. Mitchell had requested and received a digital camera for this mission, planning to document any significant findings with photographs that could be analyzed later by intelligence specialists. The mysterious convoy she had spotted during her return flight remained a priority intelligence target. Recent satellite imagery, captured during brief windows when the electromagnetic interference cleared, had confirmed the presence of multiple vehicle formations moving through the region. Some appeared to be retreating enemy forces, while others might be friendly patrols or logistics convoys. The only way to determine which was which would be through direct visual reconnaissance. As Mitchell taxied out for takeoff, she noticed increased activity around the base perimeter. Additional security forces had been deployed, and she could see the distinctive profiles of counter-rocket and mortar systems being positioned around critical facilities. The morning's attack had served as a wake-up call about the base's vulnerability during periods of degraded electronic defensive capabilities. Hammer 2-1, you are cleared for takeoff on runway 27. Contact departure control on button 4. The tower controller transmitted, his voice much clearer now that radio communications were slowly returning to normal. The takeoff was routine, but Mitchell found herself paying closer attention to backup systems and emergency procedures than she normally would. The morning's experiences had reinforced the importance of being prepared for equipment failures and unexpected situations. In military aviation, redundancy and backup planning could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. As she climbed toward her cruising altitude, Mitchell established radio contact with the airborne warning and control aircraft that had recently arrived in the area. The AWACS crew was working to re-establish air traffic control and surveillance coverage after the morning's electronic warfare conditions had effectively blinded most radar systems. Hammer 2-1, this is Magic 7-5. We have you on radar at this time. Be advised that we are tracking multiple surface contacts in your area of operations. Some appear to be military vehicles, but we cannot determine friend or foe status due to continued IFF system problems, the AWACS controller reported. IFF, identification friend or foe, systems had been among the casualties of the electromagnetic interference. Without these automated systems, identifying aircraft and vehicles required visual confirmation, a time-consuming and potentially dangerous process in a combat environment. But it was exactly the kind of mission that the A-10 was designed for, with its excellent visibility and ability to operate at low altitudes where detailed observation was possible. Mitchell acknowledged the AWACS transmission and began flying toward the last known position of the convoy she had observed earlier. Using her paper chart and visual landmarks, she estimated that they should be approximately 20 miles northeast of her current position if they had maintained their original course and speed. The landscape below showed increasing signs of military activity as she approached the target area. She could see tire tracks in the sand indicating heavy vehicle traffic, and there were several locations where it appeared that vehicles had stopped for extended periods, possibly for maintenance or tactical planning. The pattern suggested organized military movement rather than random civilian activity. As she began a systematic search pattern, Mitchell spotted dust clouds on the horizon indicating active vehicle movement. There appeared to be at least 2 separate convoys moving along different routes, both heading generally eastward toward the border region. The tactical significance of their movements would depend on whether they were friendly forces conducting operations or enemy forces attempting to escape the area. Mitchell decided to investigate the closer convoy first, approaching from high altitude to avoid detection while conducting initial reconnaissance. Through her binoculars, she could see that it consisted of 7 vehicles in a tactical formation, moving at speeds consistent with military operations. But positive identification would require getting much closer, potentially exposing herself to ground fire if they turned out to be hostile. The lessons from earlier in the day guided her approach to the reconnaissance mission. Rather than descending immediately for a close look, she decided to observe the convoy's behavior for several minutes to gather intelligence about their intentions and capabilities. Enemy forces often revealed themselves through their actions, even when their equipment and uniforms were camouflaged or deceptive. What she observed over the next 10 minutes was telling. The convoy was moving with tactical discipline, maintaining proper spacing between vehicles and using terrain features for concealment when possible. But they were also displaying orange recognition panels on their lead vehicles, panels that were clearly visible from the air, but that had not been displayed when she first spotted them hours earlier. The timing of the panel display was suspicious. Friendly forces typically deployed recognition panels at the beginning of air operations, not after they had been under aerial observation for extended periods. It suggested that the convoy might be attempting to deceive aerial reconnaissance, a tactic that enemy forces had used successfully in other theaters of operation. Mitchell decided to test her theory by conducting a low-altitude pass over the convoy, similar to what she had done with the lost friendly convoy earlier in the day. If these were indeed friendly forces, they should respond with appropriate recognition signals and possibly radio communications. If they were enemy forces attempting deception, their response might reveal their true nature. As she descended toward the convoy, Mitchell was careful to approach from an angle that would allow her to escape quickly if they opened fire. The A-10 was tough, but it wasn't invulnerable to concentrated ground fire, especially if the enemy forces were equipped with modern anti-aircraft weapons. Her low-altitude pass immediately triggered a response from the convoy, but it wasn't what she expected. Instead of friendly recognition signals, she saw several individuals dismounting from vehicles and taking cover in fighting positions. More importantly, she spotted the distinctive outline of what appeared to be a surface-to-air missile system mounted on one of the vehicles. Mitchell immediately broke off her approach and began evasive maneuvers, calling for support over the radio. Magic 75, Hammer 2-1 has identified hostile surface-to-air threat in Grid Square Delta 4. Request immediate support for engagement. The response from the AWACS aircraft was immediate, but not encouraging. Hammer 2-1, Magic 75. Closest support is 15 minutes out. You are cleared to engage if you assess immediate threat to friendly forces or your own aircraft. Mitchell found herself facing another split-second tactical decision. The convoy was clearly hostile, and they were positioned along a route that friendly forces might use for future operations. The surface-to-air missile system posed a significant threat to aircraft operating in the area. But engaging a 7-vehicle convoy single-handedly was risky, especially if they were equipped with modern weapons systems. The decision was made for her when she saw the characteristic smoke trail of a surface-to-air missile launch. The enemy had fired first, giving her clear justification for immediate engagement under the rules of engagement. Mitchell immediately began defensive maneuvering while simultaneously lining up for an attack run on the missile system. The A-10 surface-to-air missile was relatively primitive by modern standards, but it was still deadly if it connected with its target. Mitchell deployed chaff and flares while maneuvering aggressively to break the missile's lock-on. The A-10's twin engines provided redundancy that was crucial for surviving missile attacks. Even if one engine was damaged, the aircraft could continue flying on the remaining engine. The missile detonated harmlessly behind her aircraft as Mitchell rolled into her attack run. Her primary target was the vehicle carrying the surface-to-air missile system, which posed the greatest immediate threat to air operations in the area. But she also needed to disable the convoy's ability to escape or call for reinforcements. Her first burst from the GAU-8 cannon was devastatingly effective. The 30mm depleted uranium rounds tore through the missile carrier, causing a secondary explosion that confirmed the destruction of the threat system. Mitchell immediately repositioned for attack runs on the remaining vehicles, using the terrain to mask her approach and avoid concentrated ground fire. The enemy forces were well-trained and disciplined, taking cover and returning fire with small arms and machine guns. But they were also trapped in open terrain with limited cover, making them vulnerable to attack from the air. Mitchell systematically engaged each vehicle, disabling their transportation and forcing the personnel to abandon their equipment. Within 10 minutes, the convoy had been effectively neutralized. 5 vehicles were destroyed or disabled, and the surviving personnel had scattered into the surrounding terrain. The surface-to-air missile threat had been eliminated, and the immediate danger to friendly aircraft operating in the area had been removed. But Mitchell's fuel situation was once again becoming critical. The combat maneuvering had consumed fuel rapidly, and she estimated that she had perhaps 15 minutes of flight time remaining before she would need to land. She began climbing to a more fuel-efficient altitude while calling for guidance from the AWACS aircraft. Magic 75, Hammer 21. Hostile convoy has been neutralized, but I'm showing critical fuel. Request vectors to nearest suitable airfield. The response revealed another complication. Hammer 21, be advised that your home base is currently under mortar attack and has closed the runway temporarily. Alternate field Charlie 7 is available, bearing 270 degrees at 60 miles. Weather is clear, runway is 8,000 feet. 60 miles with critical fuel was cutting it very close, but Mitchell had no choice. She turned toward the alternate airfield and began calculating fuel consumption rates and glide distances. If her engines quit before reaching the runway, she would need to find a suitable area for a forced landing in hostile territory. As she flew toward the alternate base, Mitchell reflected on how the day's events had demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of modern military aviation. Advanced technology had made aircraft incredibly capable, but it had also created dependencies that could be exploited by enemies or disrupted by natural phenomena like solar storms. The return of GPS signals allowed her to confirm her navigation calculations and verify that she was on course for the alternate airfield. The electromagnetic interference was finally subsiding enough to allow reliable satellite navigation, but the experience of flying without electronic aids had been a valuable reminder of fundamental aviation skills. The approach to the alternate airfield was uneventful, but Mitchell felt genuine relief as the wheels touched down on the concrete runway. She had successfully completed multiple combat missions under challenging conditions, protected friendly forces from enemy attack, and returned safely despite equipment failures and fuel concerns. As she taxied to the parking area, Mitchell was met by intelligence officers who had been monitoring her mission through radio transmissions and AWACS radar coverage. The destruction of the surface-to-air missile system had eliminated a significant threat to air operations, and the intelligence gathered about enemy tactics would be valuable for planning future missions. The debrief revealed that Mitchell's missions had been part of a much larger operation to counter enemy forces that had attempted to take advantage of the electronic warfare conditions created by the solar storm. Similar engagements had occurred throughout the theater, with air and ground forces working together to restore security and eliminate threats to friendly operations. Over the following hours, as communications systems returned to full functionality and GPS signals stabilized, a clearer picture emerged of the day's events. Enemy forces had indeed planned a coordinated attack timed to coincide with the solar storm, hoping to exploit the temporary loss of advanced military technologies. But the professionalism and adaptability of individual service members had prevented the enemy from achieving their objectives. For Mitchell, the day's experiences had been a masterclass in the fundamentals of military aviation. From basic navigation and communication to complex tactical decision-making under pressure, every aspect of her training had been tested and validated. Most importantly, she had learned that technology, no matter how advanced, could never replace sound judgment, thorough preparation, and the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances. As she finally headed to the quarters assigned to transient aircrew, Mitchell looked up at the clear desert sky, where stars were beginning to appear as darkness fell. The same electromagnetic forces that had caused so much chaos during the day were now quiet, allowing the normal flow of satellite signals and radio communications that modern military operations depended upon. But she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and that the lessons learned during this extraordinary day would influence her approach to flying and tactical thinking for the rest of her career. Sometimes the most valuable training came not from simulators or classrooms, but from real-world situations where split-second decisions and fundamental skills made the difference between success and failure. The mission had ended successfully, but Mitchell understood that it represented just one small part of a much larger story about the evolution of warfare and the ongoing need for military personnel to master both cutting-edge technology and timeless fundamentals. In an unpredictable world, adaptability and professionalism would always be the most important weapons in any military arsenal.